The Adventures of Penny the Robin. It was a quiet day in the garden. Penny had slept well because Mr. Pickles, the resident hedgehog, had gone into hibernation, and the family of rabbits living at the bottom of the garden, who Penny hadn't ever really spoken to, had gone away for the week. She stretched out her little wings with a yawn and bustled her tail feathers into action. Penny hopped out the nest and decided to go on a hunt for breakfast. She flew a little way and landed on the washing line to scout out what the options were. As she looked around the garden, Penny noticed that it was a lot quieter than usual. The garden, which had turned into a haven for birds, butterflies, and all manner of wildlife, was usually full of laughter and conversation, especially at breakfast time. The owner, Mrs. Willows, loved nature. The garden was full of bird tables, ponds, and flowers, all for the purpose of attracting living creatures. Today, though, it was so quiet, Penny could hear the worms wriggling in Mrs. Willow's cabbages. The silence was soon old news, as Penny noticed a big clump of ripe blackberries on the bush at the back of the garden. She quickly flapped her little wings and landed upon a branch in order to tuck into the sweet fruit. It wasn't long, however, before Penny looked up and noticed that the sky was black and thick with clouds. As she looked up, a big glob of rain dropped directly on her beak. Penny loved the rain. She began to sing her little song as she washed her wings in the shower. Snap! Penny wasn't paying attention. The branch of the bush broke. Penny quickly willed her little wings into action, but it wasn't long before a strike of lightning frightened her. She landed softly on the grass and tried to pick herself back up, but the rain was so heavy it weighed her wings down. She couldn't get off the floor. She started to hop back towards the nest. She couldn't believe that what was such a peaceful morning had ended like this. But this wasn't the end. Mr. Collins's dog had escaped from his garden and came charging through Mrs. Willow's gate, over the vegetable patch, through the hedgerow, and straight for Penny. She flapped and flapped and flapped and flapped until finally she was off the ground, in the sky, and flying with all her might away from the dog. She could hear him barking loud and ferociously, but Penny didn't look back. She kept going until the barking had gone and kept flying even further from that. A few moments later, Penny realised that she'd been flying for a very long time. It was still raining and she couldn't see the ground, so Penny decided to go back to the nest. Penny flew down and landed on a stone wall. She looked around for the garden, but it was nowhere to be seen. Penny flew a little bit further, but it became houses and streets, none of which she recognised. She flew further and further until there were fields and trees, but still no garden. Penny was lost. The thunder and lightning had become angrier, and Penny was still far from home. She found a tree and sheltered from the growing storm. It wasn't long before Penny became tired from her day of flying and fell fast asleep. The next morning, Penny woke up to rays of golden sunlight. She went to the edge of the tree and looked out. She still wasn't in the garden, and it wasn't just a bad dream. Penny noticed a house in the distance. She decided this would be the starting point of her search for home. She bustled her tail feathers and took off in a hurried frenzy. Penny landed in a courtyard. "Hello," she chirped. "Honk, honk!" Penny looked around, startled. In a blur, she could see a stampede of waddling feet charging at her. Penny covered herself in her wings and curled up to protect her little body. The feet rushed over her, left, right, left, right, left, right, until suddenly they stopped. Penny was afraid to look out of her self-made barricade. She peeped through a gap. "Honk! Hello, my name is Bruce Honk. I'm a goose, if you couldn't tell. You don't look like a goose. That's a red breast. That's not of a goose." Bruce was 10 times the size of Penny, and 100 times more boisterous. "You look frightened. Sorry, I guess I'm quite loud. Don't have many friends except Dave, but he's a rock." Penny looked up at him and started crying. Bruce asked her what was wrong, and she explained what had happened, about how quiet it was, about breakfast, the rain, and the dog. Bruce was determined to help her find a way home, and declared Penny as his new best friend. Bruce explained that Mr. Tanner, the farmer, was very friendly and a big part of the village council. "So if he can't help, I don't know who can," he honked with pride. Penny seated herself on Bruce's tail feathers as he waddled into the farmhouse kitchen. She held on tightly as he swayed back and forth, making the journey seem so much longer than it was. They passed ducks, sheep, and chickens. They walked through a stream and waddled over a bridge until finally they reached the farmhouse. Bruce told Penny to wait outside as he went in to see Mr. Tanner. Mr. Tanner's farmhouse was huge. It was made from a grey stone with climbing ivy and rose bushes up the front of the house, and a wooden porch. Penny had never been this close to a house before and decided that the cold stone bricks were not to her taste, and she was very fond of living in her nest. Penny thought about home, how she missed the blackberries and the bird table, the sound of Mr. Pickles rustling in the leaves, even if it was in the middle of the night. She flopped on the floor with a big sigh. But it wasn't long until Bruce was back. He told Penny that Mr. Tanner did know someone called Mrs. Willows, and that fortunately she didn't live too far from here. Penny was so happy. She could finally go home. "But you will have to go through the woods, and that's where Mr. Frederick the fox lives." Penny had never seen a fox in real life. Her parents used to tell her stories of how they fought off a fox when she was younger and they moved into Mrs. Willow's garden. Maybe Mr. Frederick was the same fox. Penny knew she had to get home, so she thanked Bruce and he pointed her in the right direction. He wished her luck on her journey and hoped that one day she'd come and visit him again. Penny set out on her trip home. She could see the edge of the woods in the distance and flew as fast as her little wings could manage all the way to the trees. This time she was determined to take notice of where she was going. She looked down and counted the number of fields she was flying over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5. The woods. The trees went up higher than her eyes could see. She had to fly through them. The dense branches and leaves were impossible to fly through, so Penny decided she was going to hop the rest of the way. The terrible stories of Mr. Frederick couldn't possibly be that bad. Penny found a clearing to land in and continued to hop in the straight line that she was flying in. She hopped past beautiful bluebells, snowdrops, and mushrooms, and the sun shone through the thick canopy of trees. Penny wondered how such a wonderful place could carry such awful tales of Mr. Frederick. Penny had never met anyone horrible except Mr. Collins's dog. She was certain that he was the only one. Penny carried on her journey, blissfully unaware of the glaring orange eyes following her as she walked. It was beginning to get dark, and Penny still wasn't out of the woods. Penny's legs were tired and began to drag as she travelled. Unexpectedly, the floor was replaced with long, orange legs. She looked up, only to be greeted with a smile of sharp teeth. Mr. Frederick. His orange fur glowed in the setting sun, and it made him look even more ferocious. Penny didn't waste a second. She flew up high and took off like a rocket. Mr. Frederick ran after her. Penny could hear his footing in the rustling leaves and knew that he wasn't far behind. She couldn't fly any higher, as the trees were far too dense and grew denser and denser as she flew. Penny bobbed and weaved through the branches and leaves. She could hear his teeth snap behind her. Snap, snap, snap. He caught her tail feathers, but she kept flying away. She looked back and could no longer see him. Crash! Penny shot straight through a bush and tumbled out onto the grass on the other side. She was so fearful of Mr. Frederick that she didn't even bother to look where she was. She flew and flew and flew until she heard a familiar voice. "Penny?" "Mr. Pickles." "But Mr. Pickles is hibernating." She looked to see where the voice was coming from and soon realised where she was. She flew and landed next to a pile of leaves. Mr. Pickles, half awake, looked at her and asked what on earth she was doing. Penny explained to her old friend how she'd gotten lost in the storm and fought off Mr. Fredericks in the woods. Mr. Pickles laughed and told Penny how Mr. Tanner is actually Mrs. Willow's neighbour, but his farm is so big that it feels far away. Penny was shocked. She felt so silly for being scared. The garden was close after all. Penny apologised to Mr. Pickles for waking him up, and he told her that he was just glad she was safe. Penny flew up to her nest and nestled into the leaves. She felt so pleased to be home. She thought about Bruce and all the new animals that she'd met on her adventure, and all the new exciting places that she'd seen. Penny decided that maybe it was time for her to get to know the world outside. And so began the adventures of Penny the Robin.